Welcome to the Quirks of German X, the series where I take a look at the German ports of games to see how they differ to the originals. Be it intrusive censorship, removal of blood and gore, interesting voice acting, all of these wacky quirks get discussed here. Now I'm taking a look at potentially the most German-centered video game series out there, Wolfenstein. We've seen Wolfenstein 3, Return to Castle Wolfenstein, Wolfenstein 2009, and now we're heading into the machine games titles with the New Order. Considering how many of you voted for it, I'm sure you'll like this video. Now, these games are quite unique because unlike the previous ones, they're far less tongue-in-cheek and therefore have to be tackled in a different way. Especially considering that a lot of the voice acting is the same in both the original and the German port. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. As always, if you enjoy these videos, do leave a like and a comment and consider supporting me directly on Patreon, especially if you want to see them 1 week earlier than everybody else. But let's go right ahead and start as always with the censorship. Let's begin right away with the blood and gore because unlike Wolfenstein 2009, it's completely unchanged. It's all there, every single drop spraying out of enemies when you shoot them and all the corpses they leave on the floor afterwards. And this can get very messy. It makes the texture in combat extremely satisfying because you get a lot of feedback from hitting enemies, especially when you make the heads go pop. At times, it was even so violent that it caught me completely off guard. Das Oh god! Even decorative gore is intact. Compared to Wolfenstein 2009, this game in fact contains an excessive amount of it, even when comparing it to the uncut version of that game. Some of it is so gruesome that it would have never even been close to being allowed back in the day. Yeah, me too, buddy. Me too. It's fascinating to witness this trend. Wolfenstein 3D for the Super Nintendo had zero blood at all. Return to Castle Wolfenstein did have it. Wolfenstein 2009 removed most of it, and now the New Order comes in and opens the floodgates. The only exception to this are the corpses in the furnace of the death camp. It looks a bit comical because they only turned them invisible, so BJ will just push the air aside a little. I don't understand this one. Maybe it was too cruel to depict innocent victims of such heinous crimes like that. But to even get to this place, you literally have to drop down in a whole pile of similar corpses. It's possible they wanted to at least lessen the amount of cruelty, or maybe they felt it was a bit too close to what actually did happen in concentration camps. I also don't understand why the amount of blood and gore was fine in the first place. If I had to guess, I'd say that games had already moved on so much at this point, so this level of violence was considered acceptable for this age group, since the game was 18 years only here. But it's fascinating that violence in games is a way bigger issue for German censors than Nazi imagery, whereas here, that same violence was allowed, while the swastikas ended up getting cut. Oh yeah, speaking of that, all of the swastikas, SS runes and other anti-constitutional symbols have been replaced with the good old Wolfenstein logo. It did receive yet another rework though, but while it looks a lot like the one from 2009, this is my least favorite iteration of it. It just seems far too elongated for my taste. I think the best version of it is still the Return to Castle Wolfenstein one with its Reichsadler-like appearance. At the very least, it actually fits on the flags this time around. Now, I'm not going to point out every single instance of the symbol, just a few examples. If you really want to see them all, then on screen and down below is a link to a Schnittberichte article that documents all of them. You don't need to speak German to understand it. Interestingly, the logo also replaced certain symbols that didn't need to be changed since they were made up for the game and aren't based on any real-world ones. It's actually a bit confusing because it makes it look more like these people are sharing the ideology rather than being prisoners to it. Another instance of the logo is on this small sign here, though I'm not sure what the C after it stands for. Alright, that was a joke. That place is exactly where that ideology belongs though. The ranks of the uniforms were also altered, being turned into generic triangles and numbers, even the fictional ones again. However, we did receive a completely new symbol as well, the wolf's head. This one is used about as much as the Wolfenstein logo, mostly on the characters' uniforms. And I have to say, what a fantastic idea. It's another genuinely clever design, as if they took apart a swastika and used the pieces to construct the head of a wolf. It works perfectly with all the soldiers being called alpha wolves and pack leaders, because they make it so much more obvious now. I really wish they thought of this sooner, as it fits right into the rest of the German censorship, creating a much stronger connection between it and the game being called Wolfenstein, while still capturing the same aesthetic. Only problem? They're not called the Wolves anymore. Yeah, now Nazi Germany is simply called the Regime.
Die Truppen des Regimes rücken unaufhaltsam vor.
No connection to Wolfenstein, no creative naming scheme for the ranks of the soldiers, just pointing out the fascist reign. It's about as literal and as boring as you can get. Now, this could work if they leaned more into it, but unfortunately, they treat the term a bit too neutrally. Characters don't talk about them like they're literally the worst thing on the planet, but more as if they're simply an opposing power during the war. So instead of things like Nazi scum, they just fling generic insults towards them.
Nazi scum. Dreckige Schweine.
Other times they just dance around the term entirely, calling them one of those.
Yeah, well, he'd make a pretty good father. For a Nazi. Er wäre bestimmt ein guter Vater. Für einen von denen.
Or even treat them as just a nuisance.
Sometimes Christmas, sometimes birthdays, and sometimes Nazis come. Manchmal ist Weihnachten, manchmal ein Geburtstag und manchmal lässt sich das Regime blicken.
At worst, they'll call them lowlifes.
Regimegesindel.
They didn't even bother finding a substitute for Heil Hitler.
Danke, Sie können passieren. Heil Hitler!
Oh, Hitler. Fucking Nazi twin.
Danke, Sie können passieren. Fahren Sie.
Vielen Dank.
Du Dreckschwein.
And speaking of Hitler, he's also never mentioned anywhere, with Führer simply being the head of state. In fact, all references towards the Nazis are gone. The submarine Eva's Hammer was renamed to Hammerfaust, meaning hammer fist.
Hey, Captain! Sie haben die Hammerfaust entführt!
This was done because the original mentions Hitler's wife, Eva Braun. Even Aryans aren't mentioned anywhere, and the master race just becomes people like us.
Sehr schöne arische Züge. Sehr schöne und vollkommene Züge.
Not fit for the master race.
Völlig unpassend für unseresgleichen.
It's all so generic, like we're back in Wolfenstein for the SNES with its Startmeister and Master State. Heck, if this game was set in space, you could easily claim it was Star Wars, being fascist in name only and not even committing to the idea. It seems like they were trying to distance themselves from history. In the original, BJ directly mentions concentration camps like Auschwitz and Buchenwald.
Places like this. Auschwitz, Buchenwald.
While German BJ only says he knows of camps similar to the ones he's in.
Aber von Orten wie diesem gehört. Es gibt unzählige davon im ganzen Land.
In fact, the camp in question was renamed from Bellica to Cello, which is strange because the original was invented for the game. Furthermore, the Kreisauer Kreis was also changed into the Wiesenauer Kreis.
We will rebuild the Kreisau Circle.
Wir werden den Wiesenau-Kreis neu aufbauen.
This one was definitely because the Kreisau Circle was an actual resistance group that opposed the Nazis. What's most strange, however, is that the game still does reference actual atrocities, like the persecution of so-called undesirables such as LGBT people, foreign-looking ones, or people with disabilities. So they weren't shying away from the entire history. However, Jewish people aren't mentioned anywhere at all, just being called persecuted citizens.
I need to compare it with the official German state records on Jewish citizens in the years between 1939 and 1945.
Ich muss sie mit dem offiziellen Register der verfolgten Bürger der ersten Kriegsjahre vergleichen.
Weirder still, the Star of David and other Jewish symbols still exist, it's just that no one seems to address them whatsoever. Still ironic that the Nazis thought of Jewish people as lesser, while in the game, not only do they require the technology, but Nazi symbols were completely removed, while Jewish ones remained. Now, at this point, you may have noticed that I've been calling them Nazis, not pea-babies. And that actually has everything to do with what I've been talking about so far. The New Order isn't an action-filled romp using fantastical concepts such as Nazi zombies, wizards, or dominatrices like past games did. Instead, they directly reference and even show the actual atrocities that the Nazis committed, like the death camps, deportation of innocent people, and so on. In light of this, I can't in good conscience refer to them as pea-babies, because it'd be disrespectful towards the real-world victims of them. As if Nazis were innocent, clumsy babies that never got anything done, but were still able to exterminate so many people. Which obviously isn't true. So I have to clarify, all of these crimes against humanity really did happen, and they were committed by real people, and those people called themselves the Nazis. At the same time, those Nazis didn't need robotic super soldiers or giant mechs and laser weapons to oppress others, and people didn't flee from death camps and giant shootouts. None of this happened, and even if these games are based in reality, they're still just as fantastical as previous entries. So calling them P-babies is disrespectful towards the victims, while calling them Nazis is only partially correct, as these are not the same kind that really did exist. Based on them, but not the same. And this is important because for Wolfenstein 3D, the guys that did similarly considered showing more of these atrocities, like kids from the Hitler Youth attacking the player with knives. They ended up deciding against it since they thought it might be misinterpreted as making light of these crimes instead of taking them seriously. Keeping all of this in mind, just for the Machine Games titles, I'll be referring to Nazis as exactly that. However, only within the context of the actual crimes that they have committed. In any other context, especially the fictional ones, I simply won't be referring to them at all, instead calling them soldiers or generals and whatnot. I simply want to let the moronic, hate-filled ideology die and not even give any wannabes the satisfaction of having their names be uttered in any sort of context, certainly not a positive one. They were a stain on humanity back then and still are now, and that's the only legacy they have. Anyway, this means that the Wolfenstein logo and the wolf's head symbol just don't belong here. They thought of a much better replacement for the swastika later on, but here it seems too much like they're clinging to something that no longer exists. The wolves just aren't there anymore, they're gone. Though, there might be a potential reference to them with this cigarette brand. Or maybe it's just a pun on Wolfenstein as a whole. On the topic of that, all the text you can read, like in advertisements, on propaganda posters, and in newspapers and such, is completely correct, with no spelling errors or broken German that I noticed. Like I already said, they're taking these games far more seriously, and this is further proof of that. If I can go into this game and understand everything perfectly, it shows they really did their homework and wanted to portray an accurate, believable world led by German-speaking people. No more cheese allowed. Furthermore, they also try to be more consistent with the character names. Death's Head stopped being the Schädel and is instead now the Totenkopf.
General Totenkopf war uns noch nie so nah wie jetzt.
Which I am very satisfied with because it sounds so much more threatening. Likewise, they finally decided on a surname, since he's now just called Strasse.
Im Dienst von General Strasse persönlich.
Miss Becker is now also called Caroline, much like her English name in Wolfenstein 2009, not Caroline like in the German one. They created a new universe with the series after all, and this time they wanted to play it straight. No more cheesiness, no more lightheartedness, just seriousness throughout. And this is also very much reflected in the voice acting, which we are going to take a look at now. Actually, this is probably the best time to talk about this video's sponsor, Babbel. Oh yes. If you like these videos and think to yourself, man, I sure would love to learn some German to understand them better, then good news. Babbel is a language learning app that prepares you for real-world conversations via videos, podcasts, games, and even online classes with actual teachers. You can decide how much of a language you want to learn, either to be fluent in it or just to speak a few phrases. It can really help you if you're thinking about visiting or even moving to a place, or reconnect with old friends and family from a certain country. I used to study French in school, which ended up being a whole disaster and left me with next to no knowledge of it. The only thing I can say now is je ne parle pas français. But thanks to Babbel, I can now pick it up again and actually study it without stressing myself over grades. You can choose between different subscription types, and you even get 2 free classes with yours. And if you don't care for it, there's also a 20-day money-back guarantee. To get Babbel, just click the link below. And when you use my link, you will get up to 60% off, so click the link below and start learning a new language today. And maybe pick German, because as you're going to see now, it's going to let you appreciate these games a whole lot more. Right away, I have fantastic news. For the first time, I actually know most of the voice actors that worked on the German dub. I'm really glad that voice work is taken more seriously and it's become more commonplace to actually credit the actors. For reference, I use Synchronforum to figure out who all the voices are. Also, as the voice acting plays such a large part this time, which you probably guessed by the length of this chapter, I'll be doing a lot more comparisons and show examples of the original voices as well. Let's start with the man of the hour, William Joseph Blazkowicz, who was voiced by Johannes Behrens. Behrens is mostly known for being the voice actor of Ben Affleck, as well as Joseph Seed from Far Cry 5. Machine Games BJ is an old, weary warrior who's just tired of having to keep fighting. This personality is carried over well into the German dub.
In meinem Traum rieche ich ein Barbecue. Ich höre Kinder. Einen Hund. Und ich sehe jemanden. Ja, da ist irgendwer. Das alles. Das ist nicht meine Welt. Dafür rührende Motoren. Soldaten. Wir kommen in der Nacht. Der Tod klopft wieder an. Er ruft mich. Nicht heute, mein Freund. Ich muss einen Krieg gewinnen.
You can really tell how much the pain and suffering he witnessed in the war against the Nazis broke him inside.
Ich habe Leid und Tod gesehen. Verstümmelte und gefolterte Menschen. Ich dachte, ich hätte alles gesehen. Aber solche Grausamkeit ist jetzt noch nicht. Bis 4 zählen. Einatmen. Bis 4 zählen. Ausatmen.
Therefore, it's no surprise that he has an extreme hatred against them.
Ich verrate Ihnen, wie es jetzt weitergeht. Ich stelle Ihnen eine Frage. Und diese eine Frage werden Sie zu meiner Zufriedenheit beantworten, denn falls nicht, mache ich Sie mit diesem Ding hier einen Kopf kürzer, kapiert?
Furthermore, Behrens is able to capture BJ's absolute contempt against figures that abuse the power of others in inhumane ways, like Irene Engel and Wilhelm Strasse.
Und noch ein getötet, General. Führen Sie Buch. Einer von uns beiden wird heute sterben. Sieh mal einer an. Die Priesterin des Todes. So stolz auf sich. General, noch bevor dieser Tag vorüber ist, werden Sie mein Messer an Ihrem Hals spüren und aufgeben.
But that's the only emotions he ever really shows, as most of the time he's just calm and serious. No jokey attitude to be seen here.
Nur die Nerven. Ich weiß einen Trick. Einatmen. Bis 4 zählen. Ausatmen. Bis 4 zählen. Das war's.
It's interesting how he shows his love towards Anya, not with direct words, but more with a sorrowful tone when talking about the future he wishes the two had together.
Es tut mir leid. Ich wünschte, du hättest Miss Quiete im Abendrot sehen können. Das wollte ich dir zeigen.
As if anger and regret are the only languages he's capable of speaking anymore. And he does regret, like when committing actual war crimes himself against innocent people after blowing up a bridge.
Was zum Teufel hab ich da gemacht?
Despite this, German BJ, much like the original, does have his lighthearted moments sometimes.
Die Antennenbojen. Boje. Oje, was für ein dummes Wort. Mund, ja.
But his quips appear less tongue-in-cheek and more cold-hearted, like killing so many soldiers is the closest he gets to having any sort of joy in his life.
Tja, jetzt seid ihr alle tot. Okay, Soldaten tot, Roboter erledigt, alles zerstört.
There's really not much more to say about him, not because of a lack of performance, but BJ is such a brick wall, both in body and character. He just doesn't reveal much of himself in order to protect himself. However, I think it's worth adding that Behrens sounds eerily believable when he's breathing heavily while in pain.
Je weiter das Tetanostatin in Ihr Nervensystem vordringt und Ihre Motorik hält, desto schwerer wird es Ihnen fallen, sich zu bewegen. Das wäre geschafft.
And that summarizes the man perfectly. Pain. Which, luckily, translates over into the German dub perfectly. Next is the person he cares most for, Anya Oliva, played by Gundi Eberhardt. She's been the voice of many female actresses like Jessica Biel and Kristen Davis, as well as Shawnee Smith in the Saw movies. Her other roles include Kotono Mitsuishi from Evangelion, Miwako Sato from Detective Conan, Heinrich's mother from Kingdom Come Deliverance, and Marie Schrader from Breaking Bad. If BJ is pain, then Anya is love. Eberhardt portrays a very soft, warm and kind character in a performance.
Es wird schon alles gut. Bald ist es vorbei. Ich schiebe sie ins Fenster. Das Licht. Wir bitten dich, sei gnädig, Herr. Denn wir reisen über dunkle Gewässer. Verleihe uns starke Füße, lautlosen Atem. Und schütze uns vor dem Sturm.
In fact, I'd say she shows much more love than even the original actress did.
I go down and distract the guard. And maybe he won't see you.
Ich gehe nach unten und lenke die Wache ab, damit er dich nicht sieht.
And most of that love is directed towards BJ, to the point where you can really feel how much she cares about him.
William! Was ist passiert? Du blutest. Wir holen dich da raus. Und dann verschwinden wir. Es muss auf dieser Welt doch noch einen Ort geben, wo man leben kann. Und wo man glücklich sein kann.
But she can't be only soft-spoken, since her other emotions are just as believable, such as panicking when the patients are shot in front of her. I have to say though, where I absolutely fell in love with her performance was when listening to her diary entries. You can tell that she despises the Nazis and actively wishes them harm, doing anything she can to fight back. But also how much of a toll it's taken on her as a result. How many loved ones she's lost, both through the actions of the Nazis and their ideology.
Sie haben Jakub Broschek ermordet. Kopfschuss. Sein Pferd war ihnen im Weg. Er hat mir das Küssen beigebracht. Ich muss etwas unternehmen. Das Zyankali habe ich aus Mutters Schrank gestohlen. Manchmal plagt mich mein Gewissen. Aber dann denke ich einfach an Jakub Broschek. Bin ich eine Mörderin, weil ich Soldaten des Regimes töte? Ich weiß es nicht. Wahrscheinlich nicht. Ich bin kein Soldat, aber Soldaten tun nichts anderes. Und ich darf keine Gefühle zulassen, so wie die Soldaten. Viele langjährige Freunde sind inzwischen Anhänger des Regimes. Ich bin 33 Jahre alt und ganz allein auf der Welt.
I still remember listening to the last one on the bridge level and just pausing for a bit after last words. That's how much of an impact it had on me.
Ich beobachte den Mann mit den Narben. Ich flüstere ihm Dinge zu. Manchmal kann ich sehen, dass ein Teil von ihm wach ist. Ob er mich sehen kann. Ich lasse nicht zu, dass sie ihn mitnehmen. Das ist der letzte Eintrag, William. Einige der Dinge in diesem Tagebuch sind lange her. Und manche könnten mir passiert sein. Ich vermisse dich. Ich habe dich schon vermisst, bevor ich dich überhaupt kannte.
Gundi Eberhardt is a fantastic actress and did the character justice. And I really think she'd be absolutely amazing in a more story-driven game, especially a walking simulator like What Remains of Edith Finch. Let's take a listen to Fergus now, as portrayed by Roland Hemmo. Hemmo has a long and rich history as a voice actor and lent his voice to various famous people, most of which I'm unfortunately not familiar with. I do, however, know him as Mad Eye Moody from Harry Potter and Dr. Jumper from Lilo and Stitch. He was also the narrator of A Land Before Time and Dragon Ball. Thanks, DanTube. As Fergus, he's incredibly crude, vulgar and direct, just like a best friend should be.
Aufwachen, Blazkowicz. Sie übernehmen. Ich muss mal pissen. Ach, Scheiße. Noch am Leben, Sie Glückspilze. Sie sind echt hart im Nehmen, Grundgütiger. Blazkowicz, bei uns hier ist die Kante am Dampfen. Wir sitzen hier im Flieger fest, während uns irgend so ein Panzervieh den Arsch aufreißen will.
Sie haben uns gerettet, Captain Blazkowicz, Sir!
Beruhigen Sie sich weiter. Schalten wir den General aus, haben wir das Regime bei den Eiern. Versagen wir, verspeisen die uns zum Frühstück.
It's genuinely funny to listen to him talk, especially when it's being a bit silly and sassy.
Hey, Private White! So sehr ich die Aussicht von hier genieße, könnten Sie bitte das verdammte Seil hochklettern? Heilige Mutterkopf!
However, he can also get serious when the situation demands it.
Blazkowicz, suchen Sie die Schlüssel!
His rant towards BJ left me utterly speechless the first time around.
Ich werde alt, Blazkowicz. Keine Ahnung, wie lange ich das alles noch mitmache.
Es wird schon klappen. Wir können es noch schaffen.
Ja? Und wie lange noch?
Was soll das werden, Fergus?
Ich weiß es nicht. Nichts. Alles. Es geht um den Jungen, verdammt. Private Wyatt. Er sollte hier stehen, nicht ich. Er war noch jung. Er hatte Potenzial. Mit ihm gäbe es eine Zukunft. Wir beide sind Relikte aus der Vergangenheit, die nur noch der Wille aufrecht hält.
Ich habe die falsche Wahl getroffen.
Tja, ist ziemlich offensichtlich, oder? Ich war bereit zu sterben. Ich hätte es gern getan. Ich habe meinen Arsch gegeben, um den Jungen zu beschützen, Blazkowicz. Und Sie haben sein Leben einfach weggeworfen. Erinnern Sie sich an Prendergast? Der Kerl hat einfach alles überlebt. Und jetzt ist er tot. Sie sind alle tot. Und Sie sitzen hier mit diesem nutzlosen Greis. Ich meine, wie soll es langfristig weitergehen? Hm? Wer wird übernehmen, wenn wir die Zügel nicht mehr halten können? Fuck!
What I was also impressed with was how believably stressed and panicked he can sound, which made especially the first 5 minutes of the game very intense for me.
Blazkowicz, nach hinten, schnell machen Sie die Treibstoffleitung zum Motor 6 dicht, schnell! Es sind 3000 Liter Flugbenzin in den Tanks! Schnell, sonst verlieren wir die ganze Tragfläche! Feuer, Feuer! Klemmen Sie sofort ab, verdammt! Mein Gott, Blazko, die sitzen schon auf! Oh, Kondor 9, bitte kommen! Kondor 9! Scheiße, das ist ein Truppentransporter!
Honestly, it's just as realistic as the original. This playthrough, I elected to sacrifice him to Totenkopf, and he was very accepting of his fate, sounding just broken and exhausted.
Schon okay, Blesko. Es ist Krieg. Menschen sterben. Meine Zeit ist
This was also the case for when he's begging you to kill him later on.
Blazkowicz. Gefangen in dieser Drecksmaschine. Keine Kontrolle. Beenden Sie es. Bitte. Lassen Sie mich sterben.
This is probably my own bias, but I like listening to him more than the original. Maybe it's the fact that Roland Hemmer's version of the character is a bit larger than life, a bit more exaggerated here and there, which fits his personality perfectly. He's probably the last connection we have to the old Wolfenstein games, with his more casual attitude and being ready to crack a joke at any point. Which is, I guess, why it fits that I sacrificed him, because much like BJ, he doesn't fit into this world anymore. Instead, who took his place is Wyatt, played by René Claude. Claude is mostly a voice actor for cartoons and anime, being the voice of Jean Kirstein from Attack on Titan, for instance. He also played a young Lando Calrissian in several pieces of Star Wars media, and served as a narrator for ads on the German kids TV channel Super RTL. Right away, he is able to portray the stressed 18-year-old who's panicking because he's experiencing his first ever war.
Private Wyatt, 109. Luftlandebrigade. Es scheint zu klappen. Wir packen uns wieder.
Gott sei Dank sind Sie hier. Oh Gott. Oh Gott. Oh Gott. Oh Gott. Danke, Sir.
Dann verlieren wir Europa. Ganz
Danke,
einfach.
mir geht's gut.
He has a bit of a kind and well-meaning, perhaps even naive streak to him, being a bit playful and cheeky at times.
Hey, Hündchen.
Warum reden Sie nicht mit uns, Herr Kapitän? Warum so leblos?
Tut mir leid, wenn Sie dieses Ding haben wollen, Captain. Das gebe ich nicht mehr her.
Und hier sehen die Soldaten wie Ameisen auf einem Ameisenhügel aus. Und Sie sind der Stock, der reinsticht.
And just like in the original, he's always an optimist, even despite how hurt he truly is deep down.
Ich dachte, ich bin geliefert. Und dann kommen Sie, auferstanden von den Toten, um uns zu retten. Unglaublich. Was für ein Timing. Von uns kämpft kaum noch jemand. Seit dem Kriegsende ist es nicht mehr so einfach, verstehen Sie? Wenn wir hier lebend rauskommen, werden sich die Dinge ändern, Captain Blazkowicz. Das müssen Sie einfach.
You can tell that, even though the years have taken a toll on him, he's matured to the point where he is the one taking charge, being more serious, assertive and self-assured.
Los, jetzt! Laufen Sie!
His rant directed at BJ demonstrates this really well, how much he blames himself and BJ for being alive instead of Fergus.
Ihre Wahl war dumm, ja! Das war sie! Sie haben einen Jungen mit der Aufgabe eines Erwachsenen betraut. Ich hätte an jenem Tag sterben sollen, Captain, und Fergus Reed hätte leben sollen. Ich bin kein Kind mehr, Captain. Ich weiß, wenn Fehler gemacht werden.
I think Claude does a fairly good job at portraying the character, sounding pretty much like the original. Up next is Max Hass, where I don't actually know who voices him. I will say right away that I prefer his voice though, because he actually uses the German pronunciation of Max.
Max Hass, Max Hass, Max Hass, Max Hass, Max Hass, Max Hass.
He also seems a lot more expressive than the original did.
Caroline's looking for a document folder, Project Whisper.
Beruhige sich, Junge.
Max!
Beruhige dich, Junge.
Even a gentle giant can get loud. Also, fun fact, Hass translates to hate, the exact opposite of what he is. Now, my favorite character in the game, Caroline Becker, voiced by Katja Brugger. Brugger has done a lot of voice work for audiobooks, and she also served as the voice of actresses like Ella Walker and Melanie Chardoff, among others. And as Becker, mwah, just a phenomenal job. The original sounded really old and exhausted, like she's seen far too much and it's had far too big of an impact on her.
Fuck me. BJ Blazkowicz. I should have known only you would be dumb enough to do a daytime entry.
But here she sounds a lot more witty and capable, like no matter what she's seen, she won't let it affect her.
Scheiße. BJ Blazkowicz. Das war ja klar, nur Sie sind so dumm, am helllichten Tag herzukommen.
She can even be sassy, especially towards BJ, whom she shares an unspoken bond of camaraderie with, despite not having seen him in decades. It makes her more lighthearted than English Caroline, who seems at times more stoic than playful.
Caroline, you're alive.
If you call shitting in a bag living, 3 pulverized vertebrae. You?
Head trauma, 4 inches of cast iron shrapnel right in the conch. Still in there.
Severed colon, septic shock, shattered pelvis.
Memory loss, flashbacks, 14 years in a loony bin.
Good to see you, William.
Carolina, Sie leben.
Wenn man in Sackscheißen Leben nennen kann. 3 Wirbel pulverisiert. Und Sie?
Schädeltrauma, 10 cm langes Schrapnell in der Rübe. Ist noch immer drin.
Darm durchtrennt, septischer Schock, zertrümmertes Becken.
Gedächtnisverlust, Kriegstrauma, 14 Jahre in der Klapsmühle.
Schön, Sie zu sehen, William.
My hero.
Mein Held.
However, she can still be serious and emotional, depending on the context.
Als die Geheimpolizei den Jungen mitnehmen wollte, schritten Klaus und seine Frau ein und sie bekam eine Kugel in den Kopf. Das Kind auch. Klaus konnte sie nicht beschützen.
Dafür gibt er sich die Schuld.
Ich glaube ja. Und er wird dem Regime nie verzeihen.
Honestly, what an absolute queen. Love her to death. Really did the character justice, and I like how her wit serves to break up the seriousness at times. I can really see why people gravitate towards her and see her as a leader. Next up is Klaus, whose actor I also don't know. His original one has a really thick accent when speaking German, to the point where you can tell that he doesn't live in Germany.
Max, ich suche schon die ganze Zeit nach dem Hammer. Hast du ihn gesehen?
When speaking English, he isn't bad, but he also doesn't really sound like he fits the character. He just seems a bit too young and inexperienced for this brick-faced bear.
I was, as you Americans say, all wet when I got them, and I'm sorry to say it was a very proud moment of my life. I want removing them to be an even prouder moment. No more Nazis, no more tattoos.
The voice of German Klaus, on the other hand, fits his appearance and demeanor a lot better, sounding much deeper and hardier.
Max, ich habe überall nachgesehen, aber ich habe den Hammer nicht gefunden. Hast du ihn gesehen? Ich war, wie man so schön sagt, auf dem Holzweg, als ich sie mir stechen ließ, ja. Und leider war ich damals unheimlich stolz auf mich. Aber ich werde noch stolzer sein, wenn ich sie los bin. Kein Regime mehr, keine Tätowierung.
He also seems to take a bit more jabs at BJ in the dub, which makes his lighthearted quote-unquote rivalry with him a bit more believable.
Quite a fall there, Mr. Big Cheese. You're in the sewer system now. You will find your way back here if you have a look around, ja?
Ziemlich tief gesunken, Mr. Big Cheese. Sie sind jetzt im Kanalisationssystem. Sie finden doch Ihren Weg zurück, oder?
But once he warms up to him, he's willing to just joke around without having any ill intent.
Howdy, Cowboy.
Ja, große Explosion. Yankee-Stil. Links, rechts, Captain Revolverheld. Guter Schuss, Cowboy. Ja!
And, just like in the original, he's a very kind and caring father towards Max.
Los, Max, gehen wir.
I'll say, the original Klaus seemed less like a caricature and more like a real person. An actual ex-Nazi who tries to be better. Maybe I just prefer the German one because I enjoy how this depressing world gets broken up by these less than serious performances at times. And the final main Resistance member of note is Seth Roth, played by Hans-Gerd Kilbinger. Kilbinger has also played several different roles over the years, among them being Batari from Death Note and various characters in Doctor Who and Fairly OddParents. Similar to Carolina, he's much more lighthearted than the original.
You said Roth?
I'm not sure yet. What do you know of Seth Roth?
You doubt you should. Source of the Nazi technology, I'm here to rescue you.
You're here to this is wonderful. He's here to rescue me. Who will rescue him? And then, geh weg, Schimpchen. Don't waste your time.
Sind Sie Seth Roth?
Ich weiß nicht warum, aber Sie wissen, dass ich Seth Roth bin.
Sie sind ein Dirty Shoot. Die Quelle der Technologien des Regimes. Ich bin hier, um Sie zu retten.
Sie sind hier, um mich zu retten. Das ist wundervoll. Er will mich retten. Ach so, dann retten Sie ihn und gehen Sie wie der Riese. Und verschwenden Sie nicht Ihre Zeit.
At first I thought it didn't really fit, considering where it is that you meet him and what kind of horse he had to endure. However, Roth actually is quite the eccentric person, and it'd be understandable if his weird sense of humor helped him cope with it all. Depending on the situation, he can also be serious and kind of sorrowful, even questioning his own faith.
Voller Lebensfreude und Neugier öffneten Sie einen Zugang zu den Kräften der Natur. Und jetzt sind wir wahrscheinlich die Letzten, die hier sein werden. Ich frage mich, was für ein Gott so viel Leid zulässt. Und ich frage mich, ob ich noch an ihn glauben kann. Vielleicht will er uns prüfen. Möglich. Und wenn das so ist, dann versagen wir kläglich.
It's clear that the German dub understood that even quirky characters can't be like that throughout the entire game. He's also more emotive when in pain for some reason.
schon!
Not sure if that adds anything important. But something very important was lost in translation, and unfortunately so. The fact that Sad Roth speaks a lot of Yiddish. I only played the New Order in German, so when I went into the New Colossus, which I only own in English, I was surprised by how much of that I could understand. Yiddish actually has German roots, which explains why I was able to understand him so clearly, but would also explain why they couldn't really translate it, since most of the words already are German. However, they also completely wiped away a lot of the words that aren't. Now, I'm not Jewish, I don't speak Yiddish, but surely there was a better way of translating Shimshin to just giant and Jingele directly to boy.
Wow, Shimshin. What is your name, Jingele?
Wow, Riese. Wie heißt du sie eigentlich, Junge?
These aren't German words, they could have left them in. And this is actually detrimental to his character, because being Jewish is a large part of his identity, especially considering he's a member of the NoHud. I didn't even really make the connection at first that he was Jewish. Granted, I'm a bit stupid, but a little Yiddish would have helped me out there. But this is a topic I'm going to discuss at the end of the video further. For now, let's take a look at the last good guys, which aren't that interesting to talk about in length. Most of these characters are well acted, but still have a few unique moments. Like the plane pilot Randall, who at times sounds a bit less believable.
Ja, die Mühle fliegt sich wie ein Ziegelstein. Danke, Fergus, für die...
Even reminded me of German Half-Life 2 with his odd pronunciations here and there.
Haben hier ein ernstes Problem mit der Steuerung. Ich muss die Formation verlassen. Machen Sie Platz, Fergus.
Gebt ihm das Luftboot und helft ihm auch sonst aus. Wiederhole, Gordon Freeman ist zurück.
The other allied soldiers from the beginning are pretty excellent, really making you feel the stakes of the whole operation and how panicked everyone is when under attack.
Wenn wir Totenkopf jetzt nicht aufhalten, Fergus, ist es vorbei. Wir werden den Krieg verlieren.
There's also a few characters who I swear are voiced by Tim Knauer, the German voice of Alyx from Left 4 Dead 2.
Alle Zombie-Hurensöhne killen. Das ist meine Anweisung, Baby.
Aber das Regime wirft gerade jede Menge Bomben auf sie ab. Das ist das Problem.
Du, nimm nicht so viele Kisten, sonst merken sie, dass etwas nicht stimmt. Kommandozentrale London Nautica, Transporter Nummer 4. Meine Ladung ist zerstört.
But maybe they just sound really similar to each other. Anya's grandparents are also of note. They may sound a bit exaggerated here and there, but the way that they talk reminds me of a lot of older people I know. The grandma especially is spot on.
Sie sind ein wirklich fescher Bursche, Herr Bleskowitsch. Nicht ganz so fesch wie ich, aber nicht übel, nicht übel.
Es ist vorbei. Das Regime beherrscht die Welt. Sie sind überall.
Jay, on the other hand, less so. He's honestly a downgrade to the original, sounding more generic. The original had a nice accent and some, like, cool speech mannerisms, man. Well, this one doesn't.
Wow, so happy to, see you, man. What's it been, 3 months since they hauled you away? I thought you were dead, actually. They send people off to that prison, they, don't come back, you know? It's a trip, and you brought some new cats with you, actual, reinforcements. It's cool, man.
Wow, bin ich froh, dich zu sehen, Mann. Wie lang war's? 3 Monate, seit sie dich weggeschleppt haben? Hab gedacht, du wärst tot. Viele Leute, die in dem Knast landen, kommen da nie wieder raus. Echt stark. Und du hast ein paar neue mitgebracht. Sogar richtige Verstärkung. Echt cool, Mann.
The actor isn't to blame, they just picked the wrong one for the role. Similarly, Bombard is also just okay. I just don't really care much for his voice. I thought it was Klaus-Dieter Klebsch, voice of German Bill from Left 4 Dead at first, but it's actually Dieter Brandecker.
Wer gesehen hat, was ich gesehen habe, der muss eigentlich einen Sprung in der Schüssel haben. Aber warum habe ich keinen? Oder habe ich einen und hab's nicht mitbekommen?
Still, the original Bombardier was actually voiced by a black man, which obviously fits better. Maybe I don't care for the voice because I already don't like Bombardier, I just think he's boring and doesn't add much. However, who does add a lot is Tekla, my other favorite character in the game. She's played by Joey Cordvin, whose previous roles include Jinja from As Told by Jinja, Tsunade from Naruto, as well as several characters in Dr. House. I love how much she rambles on and on and on and on and on and on and on about math and probabilities, and how she mumbles to herself under her breath, really selling the idea that this woman barely sleeps, if at all, and that she's obsessed with numbers.
Was machen Sie denn hier?
Auch schön, Sie zu sehen, Tekla.
Sie sollten eigentlich tot sein, Fergus Reed. Sie waren 3 Monate weg. Das ist echt seltsam. Keiner kommt aus Eisenwald zurück. Und sie, eine Ewigkeit spurlos verschwunden. Und ich habe viel über sie gehört. Angeblich 1946 gestorben. Falschinformationen wie immer. Sie, ich weiß noch nicht mal, wer sie sind. Seltsame Unbekannte. Also daran habe ich nicht gedacht. Ich muss mein ganzes Modell überdenken. Ich hätte da mal eine Frage. Er wird es nicht verstehen. Wo landen Sie, wenn Sie das Bewusstsein verlieren? Wollen Sie das überhaupt wissen?
Was?
Überraschung, Überraschung.
Was ist mit der Seele?
Seele. Ich wusste, er ist dumm. Es gibt keine Seele. Wir sind biologische Maschinen, nicht mehr und nicht weniger. Idiot. Die Seele ist nur eine triviale Einbildung von Priestern und Märchenerzählern. Sie sind eine Anomalie. Ein Sonderfall. Nutzlos. Ein lachender Anus, das sind Sie!
I also found it very sweet how she was willing to accept her fate, especially after being thought of Ren and BJ.
Der Weg vor Ihnen ist lang und so steinig, dass ich mich frage, ob Ihr Kopf das aushält. Mein Weg endet hier, an diesem Tag. Ich bin froh, einen Freund gefunden zu haben.
The other characters are honestly just okay, so not much to talk about there. But that's all the good guys done. Now let's take a look at the rest. The first villain is Irene Engel, portrayed by Tina Eschmann, who has been an actress and voice actress for quite some time. Unfortunately, not starring in anything I'm familiar with. I could have sworn that it was actually the same person as in the original, Nina Franoschek. If I hadn't looked this up beforehand, I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference because they sound pretty much identical. I'm not sure why they even recast at all in that sense. Anyway, this Engel is still just as creepy in a very uncomfortable, almost sexual way. Like she's toying with you not because she thinks of you as lesser, but because she wants to assault you to pleasure herself.
Augenblick mal. Lassen Sie sich mal ansehen. Ja. Sehr schöne und vollkommene Züge. Ich möchte Sie einem Test unterziehen. Mit diesem Test lässt sich feststellen, ob Ihr Geist womöglich verunreinigt ist.
This is made even worse when she makes it clear how much power she has over you and how willing she is to abuse it.
Und wenn nicht, dann werde ich Sie erschießen. Haben Sie verstanden? Ich hätte sagen sollen, dass es Ihre letzte Wahl ist. Also wählen Sie weise.
And much like the original actress, Eschmann manages to get across how much she hates quote-unquote lesser people like non-Aryans. Or whatever the equivalent to that is here.
Sie haben Glück, hier gelandet zu sein. Sie haben Glück, mir zu dienen. Ich bin hier, um Gottes Fehler auszubügeln. Sie sind nicht sauber. Sie sind Abweichler.
While the two women are very similar in their performances, each have unique strengths and weaknesses. For instance, I prefer the original's laughter because she sounds way more deranged.
Das ist nur ein Test!
Das ist nur ein Test!
Diese Bilder! Urlaubsfotos, alte Kriegsaufnahmen, gar nichts!
Diese Bilder! Urlaubsfotos, alte Kriegsaufnahmen, gar nichts!
At the same time, I believe her sexual innuendos work better in German, since she sounds a lot sleazier there.
Wählen Sie das Foto, das Sie erregt. Wenn Sie wissen, was ich meine. Wählen Sie das Foto, das Sie erregt. Wenn Sie wissen, was ich meine.
German Engel is a bit less believable when in pain, however. But when half her face is missing, she delivers a superior performance, talking with this disgusting, raspy voice, like she's throwing up her words.
For your crime, you will die like vermin. I will hunt you down. In the end of the earth I will find you. Your skin charred, your fats rendered, your kind exterminated. And I will feed your flesh to the furnace. Ihr Verbrechen sterben sie wie Ungeziefer. Ich werde sie jagen. Und am Ende finde ich sie, ihre Haut verbrannt und Körper verkohlt. Sie und ihresgleichen ausgelöscht. Am Ende werde ich sie verbrennen.
I also find it interesting how much her character changes between dubs at times. After her boy toy Booby gets killed, English Angle is distraught, but you can tell that she harbors a lot of hatred and anger towards BJ for what he did. The German one, however, is just sobbing, like she doesn't even care about BJ at all, just thinking about how much she misses Booby. Overall, I'd say I prefer the original voice since she sounded a bit more natural and like she was made for the role. Eschmann isn't bad at all, I just feel like she doesn't capture the character as well. While we're on the topic, here's Booby, played by Martin Zabel. He's also done a lot of voice work over the years, much of which was for video games. Such as a Hell Priest in Doom Eternal, Bandit from Rainbow Six Siege, a couple Bloodborne, Fallout and Mass Effect characters, Father Jeremy in Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, and Heisenberg in Resident Evil Village. He also voiced several unrelated roles in later Wolfenstein titles. I wonder if that's going to sound a bit odd when we get to those. In the original, Booby is played by Thomas Mikusch. While his German isn't bad, I can tell why they recast him, since he's an Austrian actor and has a really thick accent.
Sie müssten diese Dame schon entschuldigen, aber sie ist sehr stolz darauf, diese Bilderrätsel mit wildfremden Männern zu spielen.
They could have played it off as a Bavarian one, which honestly would have fit his character, but unfortunately Booby is from Berlin, explaining why they changed it. Both performances are pretty much the same though. Zabel manages to make him sound almost childlike, as if he never had to mature and was given everything he ever wanted on a silver platter.
Wie? Ja, mir gefallen seine Augen. Nee, der kommt mir irgendwie bekannt vor. Der kann sicher schwer arbeiten, bitte, Frau Engel.
He's also still creepy like Engel, but in a different way. He makes it clear that the only thing he cares about is her, and would gladly make everyone else suffer and die just to see her happy.
Warmes Blut, der Geruch. Er macht mich krank. Aber ich tue alles für ein Lächeln von ihr.
A perfect personification of Nazis that profited off of other people's misery, but didn't even want to get their hands dirty for it. Absolutely pathetic, and he really deserved what was coming to him. And now, the face of Wolfenstein as a series, a man that's been with us for 3 games now, Totenkopf. And his actor is Bodo Wolf, one of my all-time favorite voice actors, and who was also a big reason for why I became interested in voice acting in the first place. He's another celebrity, having served as the main voice actor for Alan Alda, John Lithgow, Christopher Walken, Tony Shalhoub as Monk, Paul Guilford in CSI Vegas, and Bryan Cranston as Hal from Malcolm in the Middle. Not in Breaking Bad, funnily enough. His other roles include Jigsaw, Kim Possible's dad, and Joker in various video games. He's even popular outside of dubs, like in German children's series like Baby Blocksberg and Tabaluga. If you're German, it's downright impossible that you haven't heard his voice at some point in your life, no matter how old you are. I'm a massive fan of his work, especially since he shaped my entire childhood with his fantastic performances. So of course, I immediately recognized him when I played the game for the first time. I said in the previous video that he'd fit in perfectly with the Wolves, considering his name. To the point where LibreOffice even auto-corrected his name to Wolfenstein when I typed it out. Only issue is that the Wolves are no longer a thing, so the pun doesn't work anymore. Oh well. Anyhow, as Totenkopf, he is super creepy, something Wolf already has a lot of experience with.
Sie. Ich kenne sie. Oh, sie gefallen mir. So widerstandsfähig. Mit ihnen könnte ich große Dinge erreichen. Oh, ich mag die Augen.
Rühren Sie ihn nicht an!
Und ihr gefallen mir auch.
You can really tell how much he doesn't care about human lives whatsoever, just about the end result, especially at the beginning of the game.
Captain Blazkowicz, helfen Sie bei der Entscheidung. Was meinen Sie? Welcher der beiden Probanden ist wohl am besten geeignet für meine Forschung? Ich habe keinen Platz Testobjekte. Falls Sie also meine Bitte ablehnen, müsste ich beide zerlegen. Und das würde den ganzen Tag dauern. Ich mach's Ihnen leicht. Alles, was Sie tun müssen, ist denjenigen anzusehen, den ich sezieren soll.
He's also incredibly condescending, just to mess with others and demonstrate his lack of conscience when he abuses his powers.
Nur zu, Captain. Treffen Sie eine Wahl für mich. Wirklich? Diesen? Ich hätte ja den anderen gewählt, aber ich folge Ihrer Entscheidung.
Gefangene, hier spricht Generalstraße. Viele von Ihnen kennen mich. Viele von Ihnen hassen mich. Aber ich bin auch der Mann, der Ihnen die Freiheit bringen kann.
Wolf also manages to get across his pure hatred for lesser people and anyone that dares to attack his master race.
Terroristen, Parasiten, wollen Sie Ihresgleichen befreien?
Wie grausam, Captain! Hart arbeitende Männer waren an Bord dieses Zeppelins. Männer mit Familien. Haben Sie denn keine Skrupel? Wie abgrundtief böse.
I'll say that the original voice actor, the eternal Dwight Schultz, sounded even creepier. Almost as if he forgot how to speak like a normal human being because he surrounded himself with so many corpses and machines.
Matters. All you need to do is look to the one you would have me dissect.
Bodo Wolf, on the other hand, sounds pretty natural. His hatred towards BJ is more understandable because he actually talks like a real person, with malice hanging onto every word.
Was machen Sie denn da drin? Einen alten Freund besuchen? So einen Besuch habe ich wirklich lange nicht mehr bekommen.
While Schultz's Totenkopf struggles to even talk at all.
What are you doing in there? An old friend come to visit? I haven't had a visitor like you in a long time.
Though, he manages to sound more believable when screaming. And also when laughing shortly before his death.
So colorful. So naive.
On the other hand, Wolf is better at speaking German.
Ich bin General Straße, der Gründer dieses Museums. Schon als kleiner Junge hatte ich einen Traum. Ich träumte, dass ich eines Tages einen Roboter erschaffen würde, wann immer ich mich einsam und ängstlich fühlen würde, sollte er meine Hand halten. Heute klingt das albern, nicht wahr?
As well as in his speech about being called Totenkopf because he doesn't need a demonic voice filter to sound creepy, being perfectly capable of just doing that himself.
It doesn't sound right in English. Say it correctly. Es klingt so negativ. Sagen Sie es richtig. Einmal sagen Sie es korrekt.
Of note is also that he calls the brain he attracts a good vintage, as if he's talking about a wine.
Is a good one. Das ist ein guter Jahrgang.
Which shows his disregard for human lives even more. I'm really torn over which version I prefer. The German one seems more down to earth, which is good as he seems more human. Though Totenkopf is anything but human at this point. Honestly, I think they're both on the same level in terms of quality. But as a longtime fan of Wolf, I'd have to pick him. And to finish it all off, here's the general soldiers and officers and whatnot. Most of the lines were completely unchanged because the original performances already were in German and sounded perfectly fine as well. Some lines were redubbed to remove references to Hitler and the Nazis for obvious reasons, and others because they were initially in English.
Do you realize who I am? It would serve you well if you stop what you are doing and release me. Ist Ihnen überhaupt klar, wer ich bin? Sie sollten lieber aufhören und mich sofort freilassen.
Other times they had to redo the lines because the original actors had really thick accents like the Austrian or Bavarian.
Was hier vorgeht, die haben einem Offizier bei der Befehlsausführung
Unser Befehl lautet nicht, die Betreuer zu töten.
Was war mit der hier? Keine Ahnung. Bringt es in den Keller. Soll der
Komm
entscheiden.
auf! Was hier vorgeht? Sie haben einen Offizier im Dienst angegriffen!
Nicht den Betreuer zu töten.
Was machen wir mit der hier? Keine Ahnung. Papa? Bringt sie zu Keller. Das soll er sein.
Most non-German players would likely not be able to tell the difference, but for us, it's quite noticeable. It's perfectly fine if some of them have these accents, as Bavaria is still in Germany after all. It's just a bit strange when every second person you come across sounds like they are from the south.
Wenn du ein gesundheitliches Problem hast, ist das einzig und allein einer ungesunden Lebensweise nachzugehen. Einzig und allein.
And redoing these lines was a really good decision, since some of the new actors sound even more like bastards, making it all the easier to hate them.
Wir schließen diese Einrichtung. Ihre Dienste werden nicht länger benötigt. Na, kein Grund, rührselig zu werden, Doktor. Sie haben zufriedenstellende Arbeit geleistet.
Wir schließen diese Einrichtung. Ihre Dienste werden nicht länger benötigt. Kein Grund, rührselig zu werden, Doktor. Sie haben zufriedenstellende Arbeit geleistet.
But other times, both the actors and the lines are exactly the same, so I struggle to understand why they had to be redone.
Solche Dreistigkeit habe ich von Ungeziefern wie dir noch nie gesehen. Unglaublich. Da denkt man, man wüsste, wie ein Insekt denkt. Und was von ihm zu erwarten ist. Solche Dreistigkeit habe ich von Ungeziefern wie dir noch nie gesehen. Unglaublich. Da denkt man, man wüsste, wie ein Insekt denkt. Und was von ihm zu erwarten ist.
During combat, the soldiers shout out commands to each other and yell battle cries, all of which are exactly the same in both versions and sound scarily realistic. Out of all the Wolfenstein games, these ones are the most lifelike by far. In fact, it was such good German that it ended up being very useful for me during combat, since I could hear right away whether they were reloading, changing positions, or telling me they know where I am.
Ich wechsle meine Position! Hinter der Säule! Näher mich von der Seite! Ein Terrorist! Terrorist! Bewege dich! Bewege dich! Aufwachen! Du versperrst mir die Sicht! Geh zur Seite! Ich habe keine Munition mehr! Ich habe Sichtkontakt! Tötet ihn! Positionswechsel! Keine Munition!
I'm not sure if you can even enable subtitles for them in English, so this actually means that German-speaking players get the superior gaming experience here. It's kind of like the Marines from Half-Life 1, which call out what they're doing so the player can act accordingly. But ironically, in German Half-Life 1, it was harder to understand them due to them being turned into robots. So suck on that, we finally have it better! It's also interesting considering they made enemies speak English in the previous games.
Surrender, and I never get
I guess they wanted to keep a level of realism, since it made no sense for soldiers to tell their enemies what they're doing. Aside from that, they also sound less funny than in the other games. They're still over the top, half their sentences being shouted at the top of the lungs, but it's less in a silly way and more in a mad from anger kind of way, because they're such massive fanatics.
Du bist erledigt, Freundchen! Hab ich dich gefunden! Ich kann dich sehen! Was glaubst du, wohin du gehst, Schweinehund? Hier! Ich hab dich! Ich werde dich wie ein Schwein ausweiden, du Dreck!
Sometimes their voice even cracks when screaming for help, which is also eerily realistic. Even when you hit them and they start cussing, it really sells the idea that they're in immense pain.
Scheiße nochmal! Oh Gott! Oh verdammt! Scheiße! Au! Arschloch! Verdammte Scheiße! Ich hab ihn erwischt! Großer Gott! Scheiße!
It actually made me feel a bit bad at times because they're clearly suffering. But then I think of Jakob Rožek. But it's just serious now, there's no Vasily, mein Leben or anything of the sort. Though, that's still being said in the game. Alright, you got me, that was another joke. Honestly though, I kinda prefer 2009's voice acting, not because it's better, but because it doesn't depress me as much. It's so gut-wrenching how much these ordinary people have been twisted into hateful zealots whose only future involves their own demise. Well, at least their death screams are funny sometimes. On top of that, they really do sound like regular German people now and again. Like how one of the death camp workers just sounds completely bored when telling you to get your number tattooed on. Or how two of the guards are talking about grabbing a beer later.
Wir brauchen hier unten ein paar Mechaniker. Die kommen erst morgen wieder. Dann machen wir Schluss für heute, oder? Ja. Komm, wir gehen was saufen. Ja, warum nicht?
It's quite horrifying that they see death and suffering each day, but don't even care at all anymore. It's just a part of their life and no different to the paperwork they have to do later on. That's how much they've dehumanized these people. One of the performances is also worth pointing out because I'm 99% sure it's Norbert Weißer, aka Hitler, the Nicolases.
Müller, ich habe die Wiesenau-Gefangenen 16 Stunden lang am Stück verhört. Diese nächtelangen Verhöre bringen mich noch ins frühe Grab. Ich gehe jetzt nach Hause und schicke die Gefangenen zurück nach Eisenwald. Der Bus ist vorhin eingetroffen. Müller? Müller, antworten Sie! Verdammt, Müller, Sie erwarten, dass ich Sie bei jeder Kleinigkeit um Erlaubnis frage und Sie besitzen nicht mal den Anstand, auf eine einfache Transportanfrage zu antworten. Lecken Sie mich doch am Arsch, Sie Drecksack! Sie sind eine Schande für die ganze Operation! Ich nehme keine Befehle mehr von Ihnen entgegen, verstanden?
When listening to it the first time, I even thought to myself, wow, this guy would make a great Hitler. There's still some audio oddities to talk about, however. For instance, everyone in the game speaks German now, so it's a bit hard to get across that these characters are from all over the world. You may have already noticed that BJ's Texan accent is completely gone, so he sounds less like Johnny Cowboy and more like Hansi Kuhjunge.
Shooting, stabbing, strangling Nazis. Ready to set things straight, Wyatt.
Schießen, stechen und Soldaten erwürgt. Wir können uns ans Werk machen, Wyatt.
But I much prefer that over what they tried to do in Condition Zero.
Endlich sind Sie da. Das Briefing findet im hinteren Raum statt. Viel Glück.
Some characters do have accents, namely Tekla and many other Polish characters. Wyatt also tries to put on an accent when singing.
Troubles, all get back. Smile, smile, smile.
Unlike Fergus, where I didn't even realize he was meant to be Scottish until I listened to the original audio. But the Polish that's being spoken at the start of the game, it's all German. It does make it easier to understand, but also makes it really weird when BJ says his Polish is great, while he's been speaking nothing but German the entire time.
Wer sind Sie?
Hier ist dem William J. Blaskowitz, Ranger, Army, USA, tut mir leid, mein Polnisch ist nicht besonders.
The game does kinda try to address this, like when Klaus says Max doesn't speak much instead of doesn't speak English very well.
Max doesn't speak English very well, but he does know Project Whisper.
Max hier spricht nicht viel, aber weiß über Projekt Flüsterton Bescheid.
This isn't uncommon at all in German media. For example, I never knew that Ferb and his father from Phineas and Ferb were meant to be British either. It's normally not an issue, though it breaks the law a bit here. I theorized that the reason BJ was able to snap out of his comatose state was because Anya whispered Polish into his ear, which reminded him of his Polish mother. But here, she just speaks German, which doesn't really seem different at all.
Ich habe schon so lange auf Sie gewartet.
Another oddity between dubs is that the formal form of you, Sie, is sometimes swapped with the more casual Du. Normally, you use Sie when trying to be respectful towards others, but these are Nazis that think of people like BJ as lesser, so they have no reason to try to be polite.
Du bist ein gottverdammter Irrenanstaltsinsasse! Zur Hölle mit dir und deinem verdammten Widerstand!
Sie sind ein gottverdammter Irrer, verflucht nochmal!
Zur Hölle mit Ihnen und Ihrem verdammten Widerstand!
Also, before we wrap things up, one last thing that I couldn't fit into anywhere else. One of the German trailers for the game makes a cute reference to a train service, the Deutsche Bahn.
Thank you for traveling with the Eisenpfeil.
They always say that line at the end of a journey in that same broken English, and it's become quite a meme over here. So yeah, that's the voice acting. Overall, an absolutely phenomenal dub. Even the criticism I had is nothing, considering these characters sound exactly like they're meant to. But is all of that enough to make this part of the game stand out in a positive way? Or is it ruined by the game's censorship? Let's find out. As I just mentioned, the German voice acting is exceptional and I have barely any complaints there. At least none that really matter. I actually prefer some characters like Fergus, Klaus and Caroline, just because I think their voices sound nicer here, even fitting better than the original ones did. Anya stands out a lot too. She's much softer and sweeter, a perfect counterpart to BJ's more stoic, almost lifeless personality. The others I don't really care much for. They're not worse, but also not better, just kind of in the middle. This would be Wyatt, Booby and Frau Engel. It really comes down to preference, not quality, which is why I like German Totenkopf more too. However, I am very disappointed that some accents and speech mannerisms are gone entirely, like Anya's Polish accent and especially Sedroth's Yiddish. These are very important parts of their characters and show that they're not, quote, true Aryans and are therefore hated by the Nazis. And it especially sucks because Judaism is such a large part of the game's identity, which you can hear more about in Jacob Geller's video on the topic. I can absolutely understand removing all the Nazi imagery because it doesn't deserve to survive the ages, but this is scrubbing away the wrong parts of history. Granted, the Dassihut never existed, but Jewish people did and still do, so why were they not even mentioned? It's not as if they're portrayed in a negative light at all. It was my opinion handled quite respectfully, or at least not offensively. And this problem extends to other aspects, like how many references to real-world events like the Holocaust were taken out as well. But not all of them, like the persecution of other, quote, undesirables. So they still wanted to show some atrocities, just not all of them. And I don't understand why, since this game actually tries to serve as a sort of history lesson of these events. Maybe it was deemed too sensationalized with its robots and the living undead and Nazis on the moon, so not grounded enough to teach about these things in a respectful manner. I mean, to be fair, the game does struggle a bit with how it wants to present itself in the first place. The German port tries to keep a bit of the original cheese with the different wolf symbols, but they aren't the wolves anymore, they're the regime. And yet at the same time, the game is a bit cheesy in other ways, with its fictional Germanized music bands like the Hauptstadtmädels and whatnot. Maybe it's less tongue-in-cheek and more this is what a world led by Nazis would be like, i.e. the worst possible scenario. But seriously? The Beatles are now the Käfer? Come on, you can't take that seriously. I suppose that's an issue with the game itself and not with the German dub, but it does affect where I'd put it on the scale of German ports. It is just as good as the original in the voice acting department, which is a plus because that's what you're gonna hear most of the time. But the censorship doesn't really fit with the theme the game is going for anymore, with euphemisms like the regime being just uninspired and not carrying the same weight. Furthermore, the game does attempt to take itself more seriously. And yet the German port shies away from that and sanitizes it by removing references to the actual crimes committed by the Nazis, which ultimately only feels disrespectful to all the people that died in those times. Yes, it's not Schindler's List, but it's also not Indiana Jones anymore. The game is still fun to play, in part due to the blood and gore remaining the same, but from a story and lore perspective, it falls apart. It's not downright awful, since at least some of these historical elements are mentioned, but it could have been a lot better. So I'd have to say that while it is just as good, it's very much stepping into the too bad to be good territory. Not quite there yet, but I can't confidently put it on the same level as the original either. Anyway, what do you think? What's your take on how the censorship of these events was handled here? Let me know down below, as I always try to read as many comments as possible. Our next episode will be about the game's prequel, The Old Blood, as voted for by my patrons. This one is very interesting because its themes of literal Nazi zombies in the occult, mainly due to being a retelling of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, make it stand out severely against the other Machine Games titles. So I don't quite know yet how I'm going to tackle that. And if you've enjoyed this video, then you can show me that with a like, a comment, by sharing the video, or even supporting me directly on Patreon. Anything is appreciated. But for now, thank you very much for watching, have a wonderful day, and auf Wiedersehen.